Loch Ness, Bigfoot, and Dale's Cone of Learning. The myths, lies, and legends of training. As a training officer, how long does it take you to design and develop 1 hour of training? A study by the Association of Talent Development, one in 2017 and one in 2019, looked at the time it takes uh, instructional designers to develop traditional courses and e-learning courses at the national level. And what they found was between 38 hours and 142 hours is required to develop a single hour of training in 2017, which is actually down from the averages in 2009. As emergency responders, we will spend between a quarter and $500,000 over a typical career, whether volunteer or career, to train our emergency responders. The only real difference in cost is the time, the pay costs involved in training career individuals. But training and maintaining currency in our individuals is a very expensive proposition, and we should be getting a good return on investment for that. The purpose of this is to dispel some of the legends that we've incorporated into training, and to make training more effective. In this program, we're taking science and evidence-based techniques to ensure mastery of knowledge, skills, and attitudes, and the things that we have presented are supported by hard research and have indicated improvements in learning across a wide range of subjects and ages. While some of the things you may hear are effective for small groups or in particular subject areas, this program focuses on skills and abilities in the learning environment that cross multiple age groups, multiple types of learning. So, for the purpose of this course, learning involves the ability to encode and implant information for long-term recall and application. It's not short-term, it's long-term. It's being applied out in the field is what we're looking for. And it builds on and reinforces neural pathways over a period of time, has built-in cues for retrieval, and has mixed retrieval methods. So the ability to recall this information and use it based on input from the environment. So our first training myth is that training should be designed to hit on learners' preferred learning styles. So we've all heard that individuals are visual learners or auditory learners. And if this is true, it makes developing materials easier. At the beginning of courses, you can do a short quiz, find out the preferred learning styles of individuals, and then focus the material based on those. And if it's false, focusing too tightly on specific learning styles, in fact, is wasting time. And what we find out is that there is no link between learning styles and learning. And in fact, from an evolutionary standpoint, the fact that we have multiple learning styles, even though we have preferred learning styles, and we're able to learn from those multiple different learning styles, helps to ensure the survival of the species. So instead, what we need to focus on is what's the appropriate learning style for what we're trying to have them do. It may be an auditory, it may be visual, it may be some combination thereof, but we should focus on what the KSA is and build around the learning objective, not the learner. The second myth is that humans are great multitaskers. And if it's true, we can have them working on multiple learning tasks simultaneously, and learning becomes more efficient that way. We can get through the process quicker, save time, save energy, and save money. But what we find is that we're terrible multitaskers. In fact, multitasking and switching between tasks actually lowers our performance. So instead, we need to focus on very specific things for very specific blocks of time before we move on. The third one is that there's a thing called Dale's Cone of Learning, and we've all learned this in our instructor courses. Basically, Dale's Cone of Learning told us that we learn 10% of what we hear, 20% of what we see, and there are some variations on those numbers, but that there's a series of steps, and the more things that are involved, the faster we learn. If it's true, we can effectively develop materials, and if it's false, again, we're focusing on the wrong thing. And what we found is that, in fact, it's false. Dale, when he put that together, actually didn't have the numbers on it. Those were added later by a third party, and it's never been replicated in a study. What Dale was talking about was that in teaching, going from very abstract to concrete examples. So when he's talking about things you hear, you can't see what he's talking about. You don't have it in your hand. And if you look at the bottom, where you're getting at 90% retention, where they're talking about that seeing, hearing, touching, and doing. so it's less abstract. So he was talking about from teaching techniques from very abstract to very concrete. The numbers were added later, and there has been no research to back them up. The fourth myth is that young learners are learning differently from older learners, and we hear this frequently, and we've actually heard it for generations. That every generation, the one behind it, is learning differently from the older folks. And if this is true, we can base our teaching style on the students' relative age group, their age cohort. For younger learners nowadays, we can spend less time face to face and focus our attention on those who really need it. What we find is that a couple things. One is the value across generations of learning is the same. The process of learning hasn't evolved in the past 30 years, and in fact, we learn the same way as we have in modern times, actually through recorded history. The young are no digitally brilliant than the old. Computers and technology and social interaction, using the online environment, as we'll talk about repeatedly, are really a method to sharing information. It's no different than slides were. It's no different than paintings were or drawings. It's just a different method. The young are not more technologically efficient at learning than the adults are, than the older folks are. It's not age specific. However, one of the things that's kind of interesting that the research showed is that the young actually value certificates more. And the reason for that is it allows them to have parity with those who have more experiences. So it provides a balance. The next one that will come out there is that digital learning is changing things. It's going to change the way that we learn. If it's true, we could speed up that learning process. If it's false, we may be investing money and time on LMS features that aren't really giving us a good return on investment. And what we find is that no, in fact, digital learning does not change anything. Neural pathways are strengthened by learning, evaluation, evolution. And the method that we use needs to focus on those things. Action and reflection are critically important to the learning process. Again, the process isn't changing. The process may change how we get that information, but the way we learn doesn't. So we need to constantly think about when we're using digital technology for learning pathways, how it can augment the learning process and go back to focusing on strengthening those neural pathways. Think about how to properly apply that. We should be doing what we're doing online learning is to build in challenges, actions, and feedback throughout the learning process, which will improve that neural pathway strengthening, and allow for application and thoughts. The sixth myth is that making mistakes in learning is bad. What we find is that if we are making mistakes, if it's true, learning is going to be stifled, but if it's not, we may actually want to build in planned failures to make learning more effective. And what we find is that it actually makes the learning better. We don't want to build in catastrophic failures. We want to have strong challenges where it's safe to make mistakes in a learning environment. The options that they are presented should be challenging and viable. So they should be given a choice of options, the challenges that can be true no matter which way they go. And this allows them, with good, solid feedback, to make errors and to learn from those errors. And in fact, it actually strengthens the neural pathways. When you're teaching skills, they don't need to know the knowledge pieces behind it. If you're just teaching them how to tie a knot, all they need to know is the knot. They don't know the thought processes behind it or the knowledge component behind it. For those who are crushed on time, having them being able to focus strictly on skills, if this is true, allows you to speed the process up and focus on what's important. And if knowledge is actually rather important to the process, skipping that knowledge may be hindering training. And what we find is that while knowing skills is important, it is a critical part of our profession, understanding the knowledge piece behind it is equally important. It allows them to apply the skill correctly, allows them to adapt that skill to new challenges, and to build upon what they've learned in the future. When we are testing them, and we have skill testing, frequently we also see knowledge testing attached to it. And the myth is that knowledge tests are good at measuring skill performance. And if that is true, we can test our students quickly, having them do some skill performance during the training environment, but then test them out quickly and evaluate them quickly using knowledge type tests. And what we find is that knowledge tests focus on recall, not the application. And the testing should mirror the application process. So skill testing should be balanced with, should test the skills that are taught. Knowledge testing should test the knowledge components that are taught. The next myth is that if you're engaging learners, learning is taking place. That the students are involved, they're vibrant, they're interacting, that they must be learning. What we find is that learning and interaction aren't actually directly related. Rather, the cognitive challenges and the personal interest are tied to the engagement, but that the learning component sometimes requires reflection and thought and feedback for it to really occur. So what we want to do is trim the fat from the courses, having very meaningful and controlled interactions that we'll talk about here momentarily. So as students finish their programs, they give you some feedback. And one of the myths is that the participants' opinions about learning are valid. That when they look out of the training program, they feel that they've learned a lot, they'll be able to apply it, and that they have a high confidence in their ability to apply that information they've learned into the future. And what we find is that, in fact, their opinions about the quality of learning don't have a lot of validity or about their ability to apply that information in the future. It requires some additional things that we'll talk about here shortly. So when you're evaluating your tests, you're evaluating your programs, instead of looking at the learner's opinions of how strongly they believe they're able to apply the information, look instead at level 3 and 4 evaluations, what the long-term impacts are on the individual's behaviors and on the organizational performance based on that learning. Those are going to be the critical keys to knowing if the learning environment was effective. And learning should be easy. That's one of the myths that's out there. And what we find is that, in fact, learning should be balanced. It should be tough, but not so tough that they can't overcome it. There should be challenges built in. And again, this ties back to the ability to fail. If it's too easy, the neural pathways aren't reinforced. And if it's too hard, it becomes frustrating, and learning becomes difficult. So finding that right balance is critical. Problem-based learning is the best thing ever, is the next myth. So this is all case studies and application type studies. So if it's true, and we're not using these, learning can be ineffective. If we're not using them correctly, that becomes a problem. So what the science is telling us is, as with all learning, it's about the presentation. So we need to focus on retrieval and application, giving them good solid models to build from. So using case studies after giving them the information, giving them examples and walking them through processes. They need a solid foundation. They need to know what the critical information components are, where the critical decision points are, and what the implications are if those pieces are missing. It's important to facilitate these scenarios that are very well developed with lots of information, to watch and be involved as an instructor as the groups are working through the processes, and provide solid feedback both during the process and at the end. So don't just focus on coming up with the right answer, focus on the decision points to get to the right answer. What pieces of information were important and how they were applied. Because there's a chance they got to the right answer by accident. You want to make sure that they understand the full process. So the next myth is that Kirkpatrick's level 1 and 2 are the keys to measuring success. And as a refresher, level 1 is the student reaction to the learning. Level 2 is the end of course evaluation, or the test that happens. Level 3 occurs later on, usually months afterwards, and it's looking at the long-term changes in the person's behavior. And level 4 is the results, which is the impact on the organization. So if it's correct, that final exam is critically important. If it's wrong, it might not be as critical as we think it is. And what we find is this. Level 1 doesn't have a lot of value, partly because we tend to not write questions very well at level 1 evaluations, and partly because participants tend to overstate their abilities at the end. They don't have a good understanding of what their capabilities are and how well they recall the information further down the line. What we find is that the level 2 isn't as important as we think it is. It actually doesn't really reflect on future performance. The student who's a 70 may be phenomenally performing once they get out in the field, process information, and apply it, and that student who's 100 may not be a very good performer. So that end of course evaluation, the test that we give them, is not necessarily tied to what the performance is going to be like in the future. What we look for is level 3 and level 4. that the behavior changes and that behavior impacts the performance for the organization. And level 3 and level 4, what we really need to be looking at when we're designing our training programs is how this is going to impact the organization and what the return on investment is going to be. The next myth is that social learning is very important. So this is that small group activity, those team activities, and that if we're doing those, we can improve the learning process and make it more efficient. And what we find is that it's effective, but you have to correctly apply it. The material has to be complex with lots of interplay, lots of information, lots of decision points in there, and that it's not focused on very specific tasks. There should be meaningful engagement throughout the process, feedback provided by the instructors, and again, it's the process of how they get to the answer that's important, not necessarily the answer, and focusing that. Bloom's taxonomy, the learning taxonomy, should guide learning objectives. What we find is that if you use Bloom's, you can easily write objectives for your learning, and that if you're not using Bloom's, or that if you're using Bloom's you rely on it too much, that it might actually be learning harder. And what we find is that the science is mixed on this one. Bloom's was done back in the 1940s and 50s when we came up with the process, and what we find is that there was not a lot of research done. It was just taken as the truth. So we know is that it's good at helping us focus on what to pay attention to. So it helps to guide us in what we want to evaluate. But there's not a lot of science behind it yet, and that's being addressed right now as more information is coming in. So what we say instead is that we need to focus on what needs to be done or learned, which is those action verbs in Bloom's or whatever taxonomy you're using, and mix that with the information needed to be successful. As more science comes out supporting this or refuting it, we'll report it out here. The next myth is that learning is based on 10% of what occurs before the training session, 20% of what happens during the training session, and 70% following the training session. And what we know is that if this is true, we need to focus more about what's happening away from the training session rather than at the training session. And if it's false, these training sessions are becoming critical learning. So what we find is that the numbers are incorrect, but the concept is. The numbers are made up. But the concept that the student needs to be prepared to come in for learning, they need to learn something during the learning process, and there needs to be lots of follow-up afterwards is critical. What we find is folks will come into training, they'll train, they'll leave with a set of knowledge, skills, and attitudes, and when they get out in the field, those are not reinforced. There needs to be a strong link between the operational component of the organization and the training component. And the operational component should be reinforcing the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that are occurring in training, and that training should be reflective of what's happening out in the field. The next myth is that online learning is effective at teaching complex technical tasks. And by complex technical tasks, we're talking about subject that is organized in complicated arrangements of information and processes and composed of many interconnected parts. So think of tactics and strategies. Single family house, the doors are open, the doors are closed, the windows are open, the internal doors are open. All those will impact smoke, fire conditions, ventilation, and the tactics you're going to use during the fire attack. So if it's true, we can be using online training to save time and money teaching these complex technical tasks. What we find is that there is no research to support that complex technical training can be effectively taught without using in-person instruction. It can be used in conjunction with in-person instruction, but it cannot be the sole learning medium. What we find is the material is too complicated and too interconnected to be taught simply through the online learning platform, and it requires that human interactivity to fully gain the knowledge and abilities. Where it can be used is if you have participants with a high level of understanding of the material, or simple technical training can be done. So if the individual is looking at recertification, they already understand the concepts of this high-level learning or this complex technical training, and they're just recertifying, or they're gaining just a little bit of information on top of it, online learning works. If it's simple technical training, online training works without that in-person instruction. But for complex technical tasks, in-person instruction works best, or in conjunction with some online learning. The next myth is that online learning is cheaper than traditional learning. Um, if it's true, we have the opportunity to very efficiently and inexpensively conduct training to our personnel. But what we find is, and this came out of the higher education field, um, that the cost from online learning to in-person learning saves about $2 to $5 per 40 hours of training per person involved. So there's not a large cost difference between online training and in-person training costs. But what actually works are a number of things. One, you need to start with very clear lesson goals, going back to that taxonomy. What is your intent? How are you going to evaluate it? What does success look like? You should share information and model the behaviors that you anticipate the students being able to perform. And frequently ask questions to check for understanding, both formally and informally. That quizzing is a form of practice, and that practice reinforces neural pathways because it requires the recall of information. So you can use quizzes, you can flashcards, games, any number of activities to reinforce and practice the information that's being taught. Using graphs and visuals to summarize information and to show connections, how what they're learning is going to tie to other things that they have learned, and how they all work together to feed the organizational mission. Provide detailed feedback constantly. Show them what went right, what went wrong, what the important changes were, where the critical decision points were, and how those critical decision points impacted the outcome. Focus on mastery of learning. When the students have mastered the material, they've mastered the material. If it takes less time than is anticipated, it takes less time. If it takes more, it takes more. But the focus is on the mastery of learning, not on the time allocated. Group work should be peer-driven, peer-organized, and peers should be asking questions amongst themselves. Peers should be guiding this. The facilitator truly is facilitating. They're providing feedback, they're providing support, but the peers are helping to drive that. So group work should be focused on the objectives, should support the objectives, and lead in that general direction. Ultimately, teach your students how to learn, how to study. Many students come in are unaware of the learning strategies, or have been out of school for so long that they've forgotten them, or when they were in school did not have to learn things like cumulative studying. So they had to remember for a short period of time, and they don't know how to study, they don't know how to get information in and then recall it. So teach these strategies, let them know quizzing works, group works, deep learning works, and flashcards work. Have them think about their options, choices, and the outcomes when reviewing the different objectives. As you're working through projects, as you're working through small group activities, not only have them focused on the end result, focus on those decision points, and ask questions about what would have changed if they had made a different decision. Get them to think about all the possibilities that occur to come to the correct decision, and what decisions would have been made that would have led them down the wrong path to the wrong places. Interleave training with other training. So basically what you're doing is teaching a section of one subject, a section of another subject, a section of a third section, and then going back and teaching back more of the first section subject again, then the second, and the third, and mixing it up. What this allows them to do is evaluate their learning over and over again, allows them to mix practice, and allows them to reinforce those neural pathways because they're being re-exposed to the material over and over and over again. Frequently, especially during early training, firefighter, EMT, paramedic, hazmat operations, we teach a subject, we move on, we teach another subject, move on, teach another subject, move on, and they will never go back and touch those first subjects again. Rather, interleaving, spacing that training out throughout the program allows them to reinforce those learning pathways, to revisit that information, and also to tie that information from early learning to the information they're learning towards the end. Scenarios work well only if they're designed and facilitated well. So you want to be involved in the design, you want it very deep, you want it to have multiple pathways of learning, you want to have multiple decision points with multiple information sources coming in. You want to focus on the entire journey to the answer, not just the answer when you're facilitating that. Learning should be challenging. It should not be easy. It should not be hard. They should be challenged. You should always look at what the impact is, what the organizational impact. What is going to happen to this organization, to the community, based on this training? You need to focus on the learning needs. Whatever those objectives are, you need to go back and use those as your touchstone. Everything should guide back to the learning objectives. If you are teaching a subject that does not tie to a learning objective, you've either shouldn't be teaching it, or you've missed an objective somewhere. So constantly go back and look at those objectives and make sure that the learning lessons tie back to those objectives, which tie back to the needs of the organization. And again, focus on the knowledge, skills, and attitudes. What is the intent of the training? It's not the learner, it's the KSAs and the objectives that are driving the training. Now that you've completed this, please visit our survey, complete that so we can get a record that you've taken it, and we'll be in touch with you afterwards. Thank you very much.